Welcome back to Dr. Deep State. And the question of the day, are your thoughts your own? And what I'm trying to do here is look at that big system that we could call socialization, inculcation, mind control. And I want to look at it through the lens of what we've called the deep state, and especially how the deep state has existed through many different regimes throughout history, the power behind the powers that be or seemingly be. And I want to think about how that transition from the world of monarchy to democracy, there was a process in place in terms of how um, frankly, the oligarchs that dominate most of the world, especially during the 17th and 18th century, would think about how to relayer the cave and situate people in light of the democratic institutions and forces around them. So, what do I mean? Well, let's just let's just get into this thing. Let's define public opinion here. Citizens' attitudes about political issues, leaders, institutions, and events. And I've given variations of this lecture throughout universities in the country. I'm just going to go full bore and think of this in light of deep state phenomenon. This is a little less on the esoteric side and the biopolitical side today. And I'm just looking historically at how the deep state oligarchs fashioned new methods of control with the advent of science in effect to control the hearts, minds, and spirits of men. So, in that sense, it's a little bit still biopolitical. Biopolitical. So, the 18th century, this is the advent of the Enlightenment, this age where thinkers are being encyclopedic in their thought. They're um, distancing themselves from what they would call the darker ages or the superstitions of the past. And what they're really doing here is noticing a force in the world. And they're thinking of this force, there's public and opinion are both French words. And this is very much from the French salons and the French thinking. And the idea was the public now, who we used to just kind of manage around, seems to be having more and more ideas of their own with the advent of learning and so forth. And increasingly, they're challenging the powers of the monarch. So the idea is, how do we manage or manipulate public opinion? There's going to be a transition from the age of monarchs to this new age. And I believe what the idea was in both the French variation of this and the Anglo American variation of this was this idea that we've discussed before, that there would be sort of a dialectic of managing people's opinions. Um, so again, we're moving from the divine right of kings, this idea that that power necessarily is sort of the old triangle, and that those at the top, whether it's the Pope or the monarch, closest to God, and all ideas, values, and opinions would come in that fashion down to the plebs at the base. And the idea here is with the advent of science. And what do we mean by science? We mean measuring things, quantifying them, putting them forward in a reproducible experiment. This idea of science, empiricism, raw empiricism, would be a counterweight to the opinions of the king, the opinions of the pope, and so forth. So is looked at as this age of reason and sort of light or illumination against somehow or possibly the tyrannical opinions of a single individual. So there's this idea that somehow a new system could be created where we'd have um, competing opinions. So I'm going to look at this from the democratic model, and then we're going to think about it from the oligarchical side and perhaps the manipulation going on there. So let me turn here to the United States. Uh, in the late 1700s, when the framers of the United States are thinking about what's the best government to make strong, independent individuals with autonomous minds and bodies. And they thought, Madison in particular, one of the chief architects of the Constitution and writers of the Federalist Papers, would say you'd ideally, in a strong Republican government with strong individuals, you'd want an educated opinion. So, and again, an opinion that's taken in different pieces of information and weighed them out. And in particular, he'd talk about Federalist number 10. Now, if you want to go back to my videos, USA Blueprint for the New World Order, I focus especially on Federalist number 10, the nut that had to be cracked to extend this republic. But when Madison's initially saying it, he's in a small state, not ready to open it up to endless federations or degrees that would ultimately be world federalism. But for Madison, one of the famous quotes here is, public opinion sets the bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free force. So the real power in society is the opinions, or those who can shape the opinions of society. And in number 10, he's really talking about the idea of an extended system of federations. There'd be counties and states and the whole country together. And that would be more ideal, he's saying. This is really the blueprint for the New World Order, because you'd have competing opinions at the city level, opinions at the state level, opinions at the federal level. A free individual then gets all these opinions without realizing that it's kind of a trek into world federalism. And I don't want to get sidetracked here. So he's painting a picture of democracy as this form of government. We, the people, rule our governments and rule our own bodies. And it's what we say in economics or parts of political science. We call it the rational economic theory. And it's making a set of assumptions that individuals, people are, this is again part of the free market idea, part of the democratic process idea, that's pretty much taught as the law of how things work in the university system. One, an individual is rational. We can weigh things out and calculate what's best for our interest. Again, this whole modern world is celebrated on the individual and his or her interest, and maximize our utilities. We're individuals, we have goals, we're going to weigh out options to get to those goals. Sounds very economic, and it's also part of our political model and democratic model. So we balance the costs and benefits. This is assuming we have free information. We have multiple sources of newspapers and televisions and information we can weigh out, and we have an understanding of what's truly good for us. And we make decisions. We select our leaders, and we, in a sense, have these other people creating laws that are in our interest. And that's the democratic model. And that's in part what our framers were talking about would be possible in this new system. And Madison explicitly said in Federalist number 10, he says, ideas exist in a marketplace. This is a very economic idea. Think marketplace of competition. And in theory, then, all the best ideas will rise to the top. So there's no point in censoring people or censoring ideas. If the idea has any merit, it will rise to the top. And here's where we go with our question here at Dr. Deep State. If we're talking about that the democratic face of our government is in fact not really calling the shots, and that the free market isn't quite what it purports to be, that there are in fact monopolies that have been around basically since the advent of the corporation, do these monopolies in the economic sphere also affect then, through monopolies of information, all of the assumptions of the rational actor model, that we are truly controlling our thoughts, weighing out information, know what's in our best interest? And that's what I want to get into, a little bit more of thinking about the oligarchical, or in Tocqueville's case here, at least the aristocratic idea of using age-old methods, or as Foucault would say, the secrets of empire, to, again, this sort of master race. They're going to master the herd to control them in the way that they desire. And part of this new mastering technique in democracies to let the people think that they're in charge of their own affairs. I'm just saying the techniques that are involved here. And Alexis de Tocqueville is just a beautiful thinker, and I think really can begin help us begin our journey on thinking through this process, this transition of mind control under kingship, mind control under democracy, and see it's just a variation in techniques that, in fact, the oligarchs have always kept us in the cave, looking at the paintings, cave paintings on the wall that they have projected. And I'm trying here to help us kind of see the light in the back of the cave and make us think through the ultimate mental, physical, and spiritual rewards of doing so. So Alexis de Tocqueville, gosh, long story short, because I got in this video in a couple minutes and reload. So he's a French aristocrat. His relatives were involved in the French Revolution, many of them executed. Very just grand mind of the 19th century. He is going to come to the United States during the Jacksonian era in about 1825, and he's going to produce a book in 1830 called Democracy in America. It's quite a thick book, and it's fascinating. It's read by people from the left, the right, all over the world, because his knowledge of human affairs was so penetrating that he's really beyond different ideologies. So that's why we return to him time and time again, because he tells us, especially about this transition of time between the world of aristocracy and the world of democracy. So he really helps us frame where we're at today, because we get a perspective outside of ourselves. So, we're swimming in opinions where we're like fish in water, and he helps us kind of see where he helps us locate the matrix around us. So he comes to America for 9 months with a companion. They start out in Rhode Island, go up to New England, come around to the Missouri River and down south. So we saw the different regions, the different economies, the different race struggles, and all that was going on, the class consciousness and the class motif. And he's going to come up with this theory of what's going to happen in the world. He's going to go, this bizarre experiment on the other side of the world that nobody's interested in. This will be the future. And by the way, all the people I'm going to represent here in this series of lectures on opinion, I believe every last one of them is an insider, including Tocqueville. However, I think he's more honest in his approach than the preceding thinkers. Let me get to it. So, Tocqueville, the rest of the world is going to become like America. So this book that he's talking about here, transitioning between the, public opinion control between aristocracies and the New World. He says what's happening in America, what he's observing, will be the state of affairs, the state of minds and souls of men in the future. And he was very prophetic in his own enunciation. And what Tocqueville is going to say, when he came to America, the second he got off that ship, the first thing that he experienced was the continual impression that was made upon him over those 9 months. And what shaped this new form of government that he called democracy was this characteristic that was put about in the air, in the conditions of men, which was inequality, which he frankly called an equality of conditions. And he said that idea, whether real or perceived, shaped everything, and it was going to reshape the world. So let me just give you a little excerpt here so you can get a flow of Tocqueville's speech. This is from French into English. I'm going to skip a couple parts, but you'll get to the idea. And the reason I'm doing this is I hope it hits you in the way that you get this gotcha moment, that the techniques that are used that grasp the mind, why some people can sort of awake today and others cannot. Tocqueville's getting right to that point. And it also gets the totality of the system that was constructed through democracy. But he goes, among the novel objects that I observed in America, nothing struck me more forcefully than the general equality of conditions among the people. It had this prodigious influence, and it gives society a particular direction. I soon perceived that the influence of this fact extends far beyond the political character and the laws of the country, and that it has no less effect on civil society than on its government. It creates opinions, gives birth to new sentiments, founds novel customs, and modifies, get that, modifies whatever it does not produce. So you got to get this idea of this whole deep state system. Sometimes it's bending and tweaking, but a lot of times it was there from the beginning to construct the very system itself. And I will argue and have argued in the past that, in its modern iteration, it goes back to the 10th, 11th century in Venice. And it's the same system that we have creeping through Europe from the Italian city-states, Spain, Portugal, Holland, the United States. And he's really talking about that transition taking a new turn with the seeming projection of the equality of conditions here. The more I advanced in the study of society, the more I perceived that this equality of conditions is the fundamental fact. So when we think of mind control, it's this perception of the fundamental. And so the idea when we study this birth of America, the birth of liberty, the birth of freedom and constitutional government, what we usually think of is the old-fashioned triangle with the Pope and the monarchs at top. It's kind of like a chessboard, a medieval chessboard. You have the king and the queen in the back, most valuable pieces, and most of us are the pawns in the front. The idea is that this was flattened out by the framers of the U.S. Constitution, and that it was no longer about rights and privileges of the nobility, but instead it would be a flat government for and by and of the people. And, what we increasingly see, because we're all about democracy and looking at figures and facts here in Dr. Deep State, that we very much have a triangle shape still present. And in fact, it's always been present. So a lot of this things with democracy is really about bending and shaping the mind. Not that there was never any equality of conditions comparatively to Europe that happened in the 19th century in America. There very much was, but it was part of a larger biological, biopolitical project of control, ultimately, of men's minds and shape. So it was a necessary part, a necessary dialectic that would happen between the monarchs and the new republics. But let's get into the techniques a little bit. Tocqueville. In the US, it is legal to express an opinion, but there is a cost. So the United States was the first people to have this written constitution that gave express privilege to the right of free speech and free thought. However, Tocqueville said, this was the great irony coming over here. I want to see, what do these people look like and act like that are given free speech explicitly as a foundation to a new kind of government. And he says, but there's a cost. You have it, but something kind of strange and paradoxical happens here, Tocqueville says. The authority back over in the old world in Europe, in the triangular structure, is physical and controls men without subduing their wills. So it controls men, but they still have the soul, the spirit inside them. In fact, you get more fire back there. So the power of the majority, is physical, moral, and will suppress the will. So what he's saying there, okay, this is a funny, tricky thought, and it took me a few years to kind of grasp it, and I'm not sure I quite have it. But in the old world, in the triangular structure, this sort of God was the sort of vicar on earth, the Pope, or the monarchs who had the divine right to rule. So there's sort of a divine sense of power at the top, and everything emanated from that to below. So he said, in the United States with this constitution, they forbid titles of nobility and then didn't have an official religious state. So what was the new God in this kingdom? Well, it was strangely enough a God of self-interest, maximizing your own utility. But something had kind of switched. Something had subdued, in fact, the will of the people to even want to think freely in the first place. And that's a tricky idea. So let's just go through a couple excerpts of Tocqueville, because what he's saying here is really getting the whole concept of how the deep state operates in the modern world. And so he's going to say, again, the power of the majority, because the new king, the new God, isn't that little elite group, but it's, the majority, 51%, elects the officials and they elect the laws. So we're a country where we begin, instead of worshiping God and kings, we worship what the majority thinks. We don't want to be outside of that majority. And this was nothing new. People in the old world kind of always, Madison himself said, people would rather be wrong and in a majority than right in a minority. We just physically, we're not made that way. We don't like to be separate and different. When we come back, that's why people don't want to see the light at the back of the cave. They come back and they're not popular anymore. They'd rather be wrong or dumb and just sit in front and watch the cave paintings. And as Plato said, elbow the, oh, I know what puppet's going to dance next, and get inside, and so here we go. Read with me, if you will. Tocqueville's going to say, here's kind of how the process works. When an opinion has taken root in a democracy and established itself in the minds of the majority, if afterwards persists by itself, needing no effort to maintain it, since no one attacks it, those who at first reject it as false come in the end to adopt it as accepted. And even those who still at the bottom of their hearts oppose it keep their views to themselves, taking great care to avoid the danger, futile cost. So he's saying here that it's just the nature of men, and this new form of government subdues their minds and wills, while at the same time telling you you're free to say anything, but something actually inverts itself and it crushes your desire to see truth and to speak truth. So democracy itself is a form of government designed from the get-go for mind control. It's a very clever form. Tocqueville will say, I know of no other country where there is so little independence of thought and freedom of discussion. I mean, the irony of it all, he comes there to see what it looks like, a people that created a free government with express freedom from government, from religion, a freedom of opinion. And the irony is, he said, I've seen no other government with so little freedom of expression and freedom of thought. So that's what democracy is all about. That's why the oligarchs created this cutout. So you didn't have to go, who am I angry at? There's the king. They just kind of, they kind of coalesced that genealogy with the money genealogy, and together they created their alchemical line that would, master over the herd through these techniques. He goes on to say, in any constitutional state in Europe, every sort of political theory may be freely discussed and preached. In America, the majority holds barriers around the freedom of opinion, and few cross those barriers. And we know just from events going on in the world today, if somebody, you just don't call out the official narrative because you cross that barrier. Just check your head at the door. The control of the majority is more powerful than any king. Do you get the power of that? It's a perception that the majority thinks something, and I dare not cross the line. And Tocqueville says more powerful than any king in Europe. The kings can put you in chains, but they can't subdue your will. So he said this is the ultimate form of mind control. Plato was very wise of that in the 4th century BC. That's why it's the worst form of government. It's usually just some cheap cutout for the oligarchs. It's rule of the mob, but it's not really. It's seemingly the rule of the mob, but the oligarchs are actually moving this around. Okay, Tocqueville. It covers the surface of society with a network of small complicit rules. This is very much like what Foucault would talk about, the biopolitics of control, and how the instruments of society control the mind and the body. And again, I'm talking about esoteric biopolitics because I want to express the spirit and the soul of man. But it covers, once you have these institutions in place, these democratic institutions, where you're now worshiping the majority rule and the idea of some vague idea of what a majority of people might think, never questioning that there's forces that just produce majority opinions in the first place. It covers the surface of society with a network of small complicit rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds, he's saying the most original minds among us and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate, to rise above the crowd. It's that powerful and pervasive, and it's so similar to what Foucault would talk about in the 1970s, calling it biopolitics. The will of man is not shattered You're not broken with chains and whips. It's not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting, in the first place. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. Get that? Such a power doesn't destroy, it prevents it from existing in the first place. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious get to work for us animals. The bestialization of man is what Agamben said. And Agamben, again, the Italian thinker, the biopolitical thinker, he said, at the core of democracy is a totalitarian impulse because it creates the norm and bestializes man, where we're nothing more than an animal. And isn't that what a master race, they've alchemically created their own master race of the people, the top dogs interbreed, bankers, aristocrats, and now they've reduced, stupefied us, and we're nothing more than the herd that they have created and now can easily manage, of which the government is the shepherd. Alexis de Tocqueville, so brilliantly put. So Madison warned about this even as he was creating the blueprint for the New World Order. It's a soft tyranny. It's not a tyranny of the minority, it's a tyranny of the majority. But in fact, there's a minority behind there producing the opinions of the majority. Unrail it, unwind it a little bit there. It pervades society. It's not forced but constrained, does not destroy but prevents from existing. Society is the flock, and we could say government, but I would say the deep state is the shepherd, using the instruments of government and the perception of democracy.